At first glance, addiction often appears to be a personal weakness and inability to resist temptation, a lack of discipline, or a moral failing. But Carl Jung, one of the most influential voices in modern psychology, offered a radically different perspective. He believed that addiction isn't merely about the substance or behavior itself. It's about the deep, aching void underneath. It's the soul crying out for something sacred, something meaningful, something lost. From this view, addiction is not the problem, it's a symptom. Jung argued that behind every destructive habit is a fractured psyche, separated from its spiritual core. The addict isn't just trying to get high, drunk, or numb, they're unconsciously reaching for wholeness, for inner peace, for some kind of contact with the divine. Whether it's alcohol, pills, sex, gambling, or even hours spent scrolling social media, the object of dependence is just a stand-in, a false sacrament, for a deeper spiritual hunger. That's why many people find that even when they remove the substance, the emptiness remains. The truth is, you can't fix a spiritual crisis with willpower alone. Jung believed healing comes not from suppressing the addiction but from understanding it, listening to the message it carries. The addict, in Jung's eyes, isn't a failure. They are a seeker. Clumsy, misguided, yes, but they are searching for something real. That's why lasting recovery doesn't begin with punishment or shame. It begins with compassion, with asking, what is this pain trying to say? Jung famously told a man struggling with alcoholism, you are a sick soul in need of a spiritual experience. For him, only a deep, personal transformation, what he called a spiritual awakening, could truly bring healing. The road to recovery, then, is not about fixing what's broken, but about remembering what was lost. It's a journey back to your center, your essence. And that's why addiction, as painful as it is, can also be the start of something sacred. Not a fall from grace, but a call back home. Addiction is not just about what you consume, it's about what consumes you. According to Carl Jung, addiction is far more than a habit or chemical dependency. It is, in fact, a symbolic cry from the unconscious, a message wrapped in repetition, a desperate call for meaning and wholeness. Behind every compulsion lies a spiritual fracture, a part of the self that has been cast into exile. The substance, whether it's alcohol, drugs, sex, food, or digital distraction, is merely a substitute for something deeper: connection, comfort, forgiveness, love, and a sense of belonging. The addict isn't chasing the high, they're chasing a feeling they've lost, an inner unity that once made them feel real, safe, and whole. Jung taught that the unconscious does not speak in words, it speaks in symbols, behaviors, and patterns. Addiction is one such pattern, and it should be interpreted, not simply eradicated. When someone reaches for a drink or a dopamine hit, they are not showing weakness. They are showing where the wound is, even if they can't name it. Jung believed this inner split, the divide between who we are and who we pretend to be, creates psychic tension that builds until it bursts. That's when the shadow steps in. The shadow, as Jung described, holds all the parts of us we deny: shame, fear, longing, grief. And when we suppress it, it doesn't disappear, it surfaces in self-sabotage, obsession, and collapse. But this collapse isn't the end. Paradoxically, it can be the beginning. If the addict finds the courage to listen, to truly ask, what is my pain trying to teach me? Then addiction becomes less a curse and more a compass. A misaligned one, yes, but not meaningless. It points the way inward, toward healing and integration. Addiction, in this light, is not the enemy. It is the soul's way of saying, something inside me needs to be seen. Real recovery, then, starts not with control, but with understanding. Not with shame, but with self-inquiry. When we meet addiction with compassion and curiosity, we don't just break a habit, we start a journey back to the parts of ourselves we abandoned. And that is where real transformation begins. Carl Jung believed that addiction is not conquered through willpower alone. True healing, he taught, comes not from resisting cravings or forcing change, but from undergoing a deep spiritual awakening, a transformation that reaches into the very soul of the individual. Discipline and external control may suppress symptoms temporarily, but they do not heal the root of addiction. At its core, addiction reflects a spiritual void, a hunger for connection to something greater than the self. The addict is not merely seeking a substance, they are seeking meaning. Jung once wrote, "Only spirit can conquer spirit," emphasizing that addiction, being spiritual in nature, requires a spiritual solution. This doesn't necessarily mean religion. Rather, it points to the need for an inner shift, a symbolic rebirth in which the fragmented parts of the psyche are brought back into harmony. The addicted soul is not just broken, it is lost. Lost from its center, from its sense of purpose, from its ability to feel deeply connected to life. In Jung's view, this healing cannot be achieved through punishment or moral judgment. It must come from within. The addict must be guided inward, toward the symbolic center of the self, where integration can begin. This is where recovery becomes less about abstaining from a behavior and more about rediscovering the self that was buried under years of pain, denial, and disconnection. Jung understood that beneath every destructive pattern lies a message from the unconscious, a cry for meaning, belonging, and wholeness. If this message is heard and honored, not silenced or ignored, the path to healing opens. What begins as a crisis can become a sacred initiation. The spiral of addiction, painful as it is, contains within it the seed of metamorphosis. The darkness is not the end, it is the beginning of the descent that leads to transformation. And when a person emerges from that descent with a new understanding of who they are and what they truly need, they don't just survive, they awaken. They become more conscious, more present, and more whole. Addiction, then, is not just a battle to be won, it is a calling to return to the soul. And it is in this inner journey, not in outward resistance, that true recovery is found. Carl Jung's perspective on addiction invites us to look far deeper than the surface behaviors of substance abuse or compulsive habits. He taught that the roots of addiction often lie buried in the unconscious, where unresolved trauma, repressed emotions, and unmet inner needs silently accumulate. These hidden aspects of the self, what Jung famously called the shadow, do not disappear when ignored, they fester. And over time, they manifest through compulsive behaviors, not as a sign of weakness, but as the psyche's desperate attempt to express what has long been denied. In this light, addiction is not a flaw in character but a cry for healing. The addict may reach for alcohol, drugs, food, or endless distractions, not simply to feel pleasure, but to numb a pain they cannot name. That pain may stem from childhood neglect, abandonment, or emotional starvation, experiences that were too overwhelming to process at the time, and so were pushed into the shadow. But what is pushed away does not stay silent. It returns as craving, as anxiety, as the impulse to escape the present moment. The addictive pattern, then, becomes a form of unconscious communication. The soul is not seeking destruction, it is seeking recognition. As Jung explained, what we repress eventually gains power over us. The shadow, left unseen, begins to control us from behind the curtain, influencing our decisions, sabotaging our peace, and pulling us into cycles of self-defeat. This is why recovery requires more than abstinence. It demands shadow work, the courageous act of bringing what has been hidden into the light. This process is not easy. It involves feeling the emotions that were once too painful to bear, and giving voice to the stories we were once too ashamed to tell. But as Jung taught, the gold is in the shadow. Within the pain lies buried potential, strength, creativity, wisdom, and self-love waiting to be reclaimed. When an addict begins to explore their shadow, they often discover that the true longing beneath the addiction was never for the substance itself, but for safety, connection, and wholeness. And as these needs are met from within, the grip of addiction begins to loosen. The behavior was never the problem, it was the symptom. The real healing begins when the wounded parts of the soul are finally seen, heard, and brought home. Carl Jung believed that the path to healing addiction is not paved with force, punishment, or mere self-discipline, but with deep inner work, what he called integration. In Jung's view, addiction is not a battle to be won by suppressing urges or avoiding triggers alone. Instead, it is an invitation to turn inward and meet the fragmented self with honesty and compassion. At the heart of the addiction lies the shadow, the disowned parts of ourselves, including our pain, fear, shame, unmet needs, and suppressed emotions. Jung taught that the shadow is not inherently evil, it is simply what we have not yet had the courage to face. True healing happens when we stop fighting these parts and begin to integrate them into our conscious awareness. This integration does not mean excusing harmful behaviors, but understanding the deeper messages behind them. Every destructive impulse is a signal from the soul that something within needs attention. The behavior is only the symptom, the root lies in what remains unhealed. Jung's approach reframes addiction not as a moral failure, but as a spiritual wound, a sacred cry for wholeness. And healing that wound requires more than behavioral change, it requires meaning. As he often emphasized, only a meaningful life can produce healing. Through shadow work, addicts begin to understand the story beneath the craving, a story of loss, longing, survival, and forgotten potential. When this story is seen and honored, transformation becomes possible. The addict is no longer simply recovering from a habit, but rediscovering a self that had been buried beneath layers of fear and denial. In this process, the goal is not perfection, it is presence. Not to become good, but to become whole. Jung believed that this inner integration awakens a more authentic identity, one that no longer needs to numb, escape, or prove worth. Instead of running from pain, the individual learns to find meaning within it. The wound becomes the teacher. And in that quiet alchemy, addiction loses its grip, not because it was defeated, but because its message was finally received. Healing, then, is not a straight line or a cure, it is a sacred return to the self, where even the darkest suffering can give birth to light. Carl Jung's perspective on addiction offers a radically compassionate and transformative lens. Rather than condemning addiction as a shameful flaw, he viewed it as a spiritual calling in disguise. According to Jung, addiction is not simply a destructive compulsion, it is a profound, albeit misguided, attempt by the soul to find its way back to wholeness. Beneath every addictive behavior is not merely a craving for substances or sensations, but a deeper hunger for connection, purpose, and self-reconciliation. The addictive pattern, then, becomes a symbolic cry, a signal that something sacred within has been lost, and the person is unconsciously seeking to reclaim it. This reframing is not an excuse for harmful behavior, but an invitation to meaning. Jung believed that when suffering is met with awareness rather than judgment, it can become a sacred teacher. In this light, addiction is not a death sentence, it is an initiation. The addict is not just someone running from pain but someone on a soul-level journey, unknowingly walking the path of transformation. When the addict begins to turn inward, not to suppress the shadow, but to welcome it with honesty and compassion, they step into the possibility of awakening. The impulse to numb or escape begins to loosen when the pain beneath is seen, felt, and integrated. Through this process, addiction loses its grip, not by force, but because its message has been heard. Jung saw this shift as nothing short of alchemy. The very darkness that once threatened to destroy a person becomes the soil for their rebirth. In that sacred pause, when one stops grasping, stops running, and simply listens, the soul can begin to breathe again. Real healing begins not in chasing solutions but in reclaiming meaning. And when the person no longer sees their addiction as a curse but as a doorway, they are no longer its prisoner, they become its student. In this journey, the pain is not erased, but it is no longer feared. It becomes a guide. And out of that guidance emerges a new self, rooted, conscious, and alive. Jung reminds us that even in our deepest suffering lies the seed of our transformation. All we must do is be willing to listen. Addiction, when seen through the lens of Carl Jung's deep psychological and spiritual insight, is not a detour from life's purpose, it is the path itself. Far from being a meaningless spiral of self-destruction, addiction reveals a sacred journey through darkness. It is a soul's cry for healing, a desperate attempt to mend a fracture that reason alone cannot repair. The true transformation begins not when a person learns to resist temptation, but when they stop running from their pain and start listening to it. Beneath every compulsion lies a wounded part of the self, exiled, unheard, and yearning for integration. Jung teaches us that this descent into suffering is not a fall from grace but an invitation to return to wholeness. The addict must not merely abstain from substances, they must step into the deeper work of shadow integration. This means confronting the emotions, traumas, and unmet needs that fueled the addiction in the first place. As long as the addict remains at war with their own pain, trying to numb it, avoid it, or hide it, the pattern persists. But when they dare to ask, "What is this suffering trying to tell me?" a shift occurs. The darkness, once feared, begins to guide. And in that guidance, healing unfolds. This process is not about fixing the addict as if they are broken, but about leading them back to a forgotten part of themselves, the sacred center that trauma buried in addiction tried to replace. Jung's wisdom reminds us that the path to freedom is not found in denial or repression, but in the courage to face the very thing we've spent our lives avoiding. Through presence, compassion, and symbolic understanding, the addict transforms not into someone new, but into who they truly are. They move from numbness to awareness, from self-abandonment to self-authorship. And what once was a prison becomes a portal. In this journey, addiction no longer defines the person, it refines them. Their suffering becomes the raw material for a spiritual rebirth. As Jung famously said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And for many addicts, that privilege begins not in light, but in the sacred darkness that teaches them how to shine. Addiction, as Carl Jung illuminated, is not merely a personal failing or a behavioral malfunction, it is often a symbolic summons, a sacred calling disguised as suffering. Beneath the destructive patterns and compulsions lies a profound spiritual invitation to rediscover the self, to reclaim lost wholeness, and to re-enter life with renewed presence and meaning. Addiction becomes a crucible through which transformation is not only possible, it is demanded. Rather than being a curse, addiction can be seen as the soul's way of drawing attention to what has long been exiled, the forgotten self, the buried pain, the unacknowledged desires. Jung believed that the psyche speaks in symbols, not logic, and that every symptom is a messenger. The addict's longing, then, is not truly for the substance, it is for connection, coherence, belonging, and a sense of sacred purpose. The object of addiction, whether drugs, alcohol, sex, food, or even work, is a false sacrament, a ritual that unconsciously seeks to restore contact with something holy and whole. When approached with awareness and inner inquiry, this compulsion becomes a map rather than a maze. The addict is not lost, they are being rerouted, called inward to confront not just their pain, but the meaning behind it. This descent into shadow is not a failure but an initiation. It demands stillness, honesty, and the courage to ask, what is this pain trying to reveal to me? As this inner work unfolds, the addict begins to see that their suffering was never meaningless. It was a coded message from the soul. And in decoding it, they begin to awaken. They move from victimhood to authorship, from self-rejection to self-remembrance. In this light, addiction becomes a sacred teacher, harsh but honest, urging the individual toward integration. The real healing is not simply sobriety. It is the return to the essence, the self that no longer seeks outward for what can only be found within. As Jung proposed, it is through this sacred process, not repression but reintegration, that the addict truly heals. They are not just surviving their past, they are reclaiming their mythic journey. In doing so, they re-enter life not as who they were, but as who they were always meant to become, whole, awake, and deeply alive. True healing, as Carl Jung profoundly taught, is not about chasing perfection or fixing something broken. It is about remembering who we truly are beneath the layers of pain, fear, shame, and survival patterns we've developed to cope with a world that often misunderstands the soul's deepest needs. The modern psyche is not so much damaged as it is dismembered, fragmented by years of denying parts of ourselves that were deemed unacceptable. Healing, then, is not a project of becoming someone new, it is the sacred return to the self that always existed before the world told us we were not enough. Jung called this process individuation, not a journey toward flawlessness, but toward wholeness. It is an inner unfolding, a symbolic rebirth that allows us to reclaim the exiled parts of ourselves, our vulnerability, our anger, our creativity, our unmet needs, and integrate them into a unified, conscious self. In this view, healing is not about adding more. It is about subtracting the illusions, the masks, and the inherited narratives that keep us from our essence. It's the radical act of self-acceptance, of seeing our wounds not as proof of weakness, but as the very places through which light can enter. This journey does not demand perfection, it demands presence. And in that presence, we begin to see that the same parts of us we tried to hide are actually doorways to deeper wisdom. Addiction, anxiety, depression, these are not just conditions to eliminate. They are symbolic messengers, carrying vital truths about what our soul is missing. To heal is to sit with those messages, not to silence them. It's to embrace the silence beneath the symptoms, and in that stillness, to discover a version of ourselves that is no longer grasping for validation but rooted in inner truth. In this sacred descent, we stop asking, "How do I fix myself?" and begin asking, "What part of me have I forgotten?" Healing is remembering. It is reclaiming our original frequency, our worth, our wholeness, our peace. And from that remembrance, life transforms. Not because the world changes instantly, but because we have. We no longer live from fear, we live from alignment. And that is the beginning of freedom. In a world obsessed with hustle, striving, and constant self-improvement, Carl Jung offered a radically different path to transformation: stillness. He taught that true healing does not come from doing more or trying harder, but from surrendering the need to control and allowing the self to simply be. The more we chase success, love, or fulfillment from the outside, the more disconnected we become from our inner center. Addiction is a striking example, not merely a craving for a substance, but a symbol of the soul's deeper hunger for wholeness. What we truly seek is not in the drink, the drug, the relationship, or the outcome, it's in the sense of completeness we believe those things will give us. Jung reminds us that chasing what we think we need only reinforces the idea that we are not already enough. Transformation happens not when we finally get what we want, but when we become the person who no longer needs to chase it. When we stop grasping, when we stop trying to manipulate outcomes through frantic energy, something shifts. In stillness, the unconscious begins to speak. In surrender, the soul begins to heal. This isn't passive resignation, it's active alignment with a deeper truth. Instead of declaring to the world, "I need this to feel whole," we quietly embody the energy that says, "I already am." And in that shift, life begins to respond. Not because we forced it, but because we became a match for what we were seeking all along. The addict, like any of us, must journey inward, not to reject desire, but to understand the root of it. Jung didn't encourage people to suppress their wants or shame their compulsions. He invited them to look beneath the surface and find the deeper message within. The journey is one of remembering the original self, the one before fear, trauma, and striving took over. From that place of wholeness, we stop living in reaction and start living in resonance. Life begins to fall into place not because we conquered it, but because we aligned with it. This is the power of surrender. Not weakness, but the wisdom to finally trust what we are becoming. And from there, healing becomes inevitable. One of the most profound messages drawn from Jung's insights is that healing does not come from force, control, or endless striving, it comes from self-awareness, acceptance, and surrender. In a culture that often equates productivity with worth and encourages constant achievement, this can feel counterintuitive. Yet Jung teaches us that what we resist will persist, and what we suppress will return until it is acknowledged. This applies deeply to everyday life. Whether we're chasing success, love, or healing, the lesson is to pause and ask, what part of me still feels unworthy without this? True change begins not by fixing the outside world, but by addressing the wounds within. When we stop chasing validation and start integrating the parts of ourselves we've ignored, our fear, grief, shame, we become whole. And in that wholeness, we no longer need to chase anything. We attract what aligns with our peace, not our pain. This isn't about passivity, it's about presence. It's a call to live from our inner truth, not from the noise of unmet expectations. For anyone navigating uncertainty or emotional struggle, this is a powerful reminder: your healing isn't somewhere out there. It's in the courage to sit still and remember who you truly are.